Heads of state and government are in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia this week for the 36th African Union Summit under the theme Acceleration of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The annual summit convenes a year into the Ukraine-Russia conflict and within the backdrop of heightened geopolitical activity on the continent. Critically, the African Union remains in dire need of reforms. In particular, is the question of financing its own operations, which denies it leverage to push its own agenda. This week on the program, we'll look at the key issues on the table for African leaders to address. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, a potential driver for economic growth is an increase in intra-Africa trade. With trade on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area platform now in its second year, we sat down with the Deputy African Union Commission Chairperson, Dr. Monique Nsanzabaganwa, to find out how the African Union is engaging with African countries to best leverage the platform.
Dr. Monique Nsanzabaganwa, the Deputy Chair of the African Union Commission, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. We do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So I'll just get straight into it. In 2016, African leaders decided that institutional reforms for the African Union was urgent and necessary. What reforms have been put in place at the AU since then, and what needs to be done?
So a number of reforms have been undertaken. It is started by reforming the very assembly and the work of that intergovernmental process, whereby the leaders said, you know, we are going to be meeting once a year, deliberate, take decisions, and then there will be a mid-year mini summit, which we call the coordination summit, which is going to only focus on issues of integration and measuring how much we are making of progress. That has been already implemented. They also restructured the Commission, which is the executive office of the Union, which is now implemented. They reformed, they streamlined, made it leaner with the 8 commissioners as opposed to 10, gender balanced. Today is implemented. Another aspect of the reform was the financial sustainability. Yes. Which is a critical one. In 2015, in Johannesburg, the leaders took a decision about their commitment to start owning more our financing. Today, we are 100% funded by member states in terms of operations of the union, the salary, the staff costs, and other operational costs. They gave themselves a target of financing 75% of the programs. Today, we are not yet there, and we are pushing. So the challenge has been COVID and other crises that have kicked in the process. But we hope that eventually, as the member states recover, they are going to be accelerating that one. On peace operations, peace support operations, they decided to put in place a fund, give it an endowment of $400 million. Today, they have already disbursed 328 in that fund. And we are looking to next year to complete that endowment.
Indeed. And as you say, it's a process, as you've just explained. A lot has been done. I know you've touched on funding, but I just want to go back to that very briefly. We know that the AU has been in the past heavily dependent on donor funding to run its programs and operations. Do the donors then determine what the financing is allocated to, or is that a preserve of the African Union itself? And does this affect the AU's ability to fulfill its mandate?
Member states have now taken on the challenge of being more and more self-financing. We have come from a baseline. We are somewhere in the middle, and there is a journey to be done. But today, 88 on average, 8%, this is a figure, is being paid So which means those are in arrears are like the 12%. So we have really seen a lot of improvement. Not only that, but a lot is being paid in the first quarter and latest in the second quarter. However, we have a few countries like today, 3 of them under sanctions for late payment, which is also another good story, because we are now holding member states who are delaying to pay accountable. So the sanction regimes that they voted is working, and they are living by it. But on partners, we welcome partnership. We welcome contributions, because we are sharing the vision and objectives, and it's really a win-win, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, we are seeing a lot of burden now of our financing borne by our partners when it comes to the programs. And good news there is all these programs, now because we have Agenda 2063, which is our reference of where our priorities are, all the partners are aligned to that. And we have reformed our working relationships with our partners, that it's going to be demand-driven as opposed to supply-led.
Okay. Now, a 0.2% levy on eligible imports is one of the key elements in the African Union's strategy to achieve financial independence. To what extent have member states implemented this particular strategy?
This 0.2% levy is one of the strategies that the Union has devised to help member states have it easier, their obligation to pay to the Union. Today you have 17 countries fully implementing that tool. We are now aggressively engaging the member states through their regional economic communities, for instance in ECOWAS, where they actually have the same system working very perfectly for them, and we are seeing together how we can have it adopted as a bloc. Same efforts we are doing with the East African community and others. The challenge has been that initially there has been maybe a conceptual challenge of saying that you're collecting this whole money and then you're remitting it to the African Union, which is not true. Okay. The mechanism says, use this, apply it to your own list of eligible imports, collect whatever you collect, keep it, and only remit to us what we have assessed for you to remit in a particular year. That has been the challenge. Another challenge has been a misconception about the WTO incompatibility, which again is true theoretically, but in practice, the WTO itself has, I would say, rules that are allowing for countries who have a free trade area or a customs union to be among themselves, treating themselves differently as without being bound by the commitments to other members.
Finally, the AU's vision is creating an integrated, prosperous and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena. What are the major challenges the AU faces in fulfilling this particular vision?
That vision we have had 10 years ago, from 2013. So, over the 10 years we have evaluated. We have challenges. Still, we see more progress being made on aspects of integration, like AfCFTA, but we are seeing also pockets of where we still really have to do some work in the areas of health, in the areas of education, in the areas of poverty reduction, and creating job opportunities for the youth. We are seeing progress in infrastructure, yet we still need to integrate more, because there is no dream of integrating Africa without connectivity, without people moving freely and cheaply, without us communicating, without us harnessing digital, without us industrializing. All those are the low-hanging fruits that are there. So the good news is, as we evaluate today, and in this particular summit, they are going to approve the roadmap for the theme of the year, which is accelerating the continental free trade area. And everyone, whichever sector, is a contributor to that. Agriculture, health, education, technology, trade, digital payments, and so on and so forth. So we are going to double our efforts to accelerate this integrator, which is the AfCFTA, which is going to unlock for us all the low-hanging fruits in industrialization, in value chain development, in creating jobs, in granting market access to the women and the youth and the SMEs, and so on and so forth.
Dr. Monique Nsanzabaganwa, thank you very much once again for taking the time to talk to us. We do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Joining me now to take a closer look at what's in the in-tray of African leaders at this year's summit are from Buenos Aires, Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, and from Addis Ababa, Andrews Atta Asamoah, head of the African Peace and Security Governance Program at ISS Africa. Thank you both for joining us on the program. Let me start off with you, Hannah, because let's start by looking back at the year that was. What kind of year would you say Africa had in 2022, and what kind of issues do you see dominating discussions by leaders at the summit?
Well, I think 2022 was a quite challenging year for many countries across the world, but especially also in the African continent. We have green shoots, definitely, of COVID-19 recovery. In fact, expectations at the beginning of 2022 were that the continent would not grow fast, but there were certainly some countries that did, and we have had significant recovery. But at the same time, we're still battling inflation. We continue to see supply chain challenges, and of course, we had the Russia-Ukraine challenges and the feedback effects of the response to that. So it hasn't been an easy time. But I think 2023 looks like it will be a stronger year. We have better global conditions, but on the continent, we also have stronger conditions. And I think the AU summit happening now is really a means of bringing together leaders to make sure that that really does happen.
Dr. Asamoah, your view here?
No, I do agree with the panelists that 2022 was a challenging year. Apart from the usual peace and security issues that the continent has, almost all of them were compounded by, the post-COVID issues as well as the crisis we've had around Ukraine and Russia. On top of that, we've had food crisis issues. So 2022 was a very challenging year. So going to the summit, those are some of the key issues that are coming up, but I expect that discussions will touch on the state of peace and security, given what Africa, came into 2023 with. So the state of peace and security, where Africa is in managing issues of silencing the guns, issues of the global food crisis are expected to feature. The ongoing reform at the AU and where it is at the moment also needs to be featured, as well as the Continental Development Agency of the AU, as well as the Continental Free Trade Area.
Dr. Asamoah, the state of peace and security, you expect that to dominate discussions at the AU, and it has been a mixed bag in 2022 when it comes to peace and security. What did you see, or what did you find in terms of the AU managing its state of peace and security?
I think one of the key things we need to acknowledge about the AU is that they do not necessarily always have to solve the issues themselves. One of their most important role is to mobilize collective action on the continent. And when it comes to that, you notice that they did quite well in terms of mobilizing collective resolve to stay engaged on some of the key issues we had on the continent, talking about issues of the spread of violent extremism across the continent, issues of the renewal of clashes in Eastern DRC, as well as the issues that Ethiopia had. Those issues were issues that the African Union mobilized quite some important engagements on. And I think the key takeaway or win was really the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement in the case of Ethiopia particularly. Else, a number of the issues remain very challenging on the continent.
Hannah, the African Continental Free Trade Area, that is the theme, its implementation and acceleration of CFTA. That is the theme of this year's African Union Summit. I mean, Africa CFTA is up and running, and there are expectations that in this second year of trading. However, what do you see as some of the sticking issues, because there are like the unresolved issue of the rules of origin, for example?
Yes, well, I'm happy to see the AfCFTA taking center stage this year, actually. I think we have had an African Union which has had to be, of course, very focused on peace and security, as Ms. Asmo was mentioning. But with a number of new agreements signed, and I think, as I said, the green shoots of green recovery and COVID-19 recovery, we've got a number of African countries that are expected to grow very fast and also have a significant opportunity in terms of trade. So I'm really happy to see that the AfCFTA will be taking center stage, but I also think that the fact that it will be important and the focus from African leaders also means that we'll be able to resolve some of the most challenging parts. And it's not easy to work on these issues, whether it's rules of origin, intellectual property rules, competition rules. The African continent, we have, had to use a lot of the international mechanisms to try to work out our own trade, but we have remained at a very low level internationally of trade. So this is an opportunity for the continent to really think and lead us to think, where is our interest in trade? How do we shape the rules that we want? Learning from not only WTO type arrangements and international arrangements, but also what other countries have done from China to India, using their lessons as well and really adapting to the continent to make sure that these rules really fit for our purposes and African interests going forward.
So Hannah, in 2023, the Africa CFTA rolled out what they call the Guided Trade Initiative. Can you explain to us how that is working?
Well, so what has been happening so far, so the AfCFTA started operationally in 2021. And so what they've been trying to do is to try to effectively pilot open trade with these zero tariff barriers, open trade across the continent in different areas. So as countries have slowly ratified the instrument, so we now have a vast majority of African countries that have ratified, we've also had the experimentation of using these zero tariffs for a number of different sectors in 2022. So we had the first amounts of trade between Ghana and Kenya in two products, and there will be more going forward in 2023, taking a step-by-step approach, seeing how it works, and also working out, of course, there's going to be logistical barriers that also remain. Our infrastructure isn't strong enough. So, but by taking it step by step, we can also work out how we can also address those challenges.
Right. Dr. Asamoah, I want to come back briefly to the role of the African Union and what its agenda has been, because the AU's Agenda 2063 was meant to ease conflict, encourage trade, integration, and raise prosperity. Assess for us the progress there. Where is the continent on achieving important timelines?
Well, you mentioned the idea of dealing with conflicts on the continent. I mean, the totality of the realization of the full goals of Agenda 2063 It's going to be discussed, but it's one of the most difficult, to measure without a very thorough evaluation. But if you can take the peace and security dimension as one of the key variables, you'll notice that we didn't do too well in the first 10 years of Agenda 2063. Not in terms of dealing with existing conflicts, but the way in which a number of new forms of threats are emerging raises questions whether we've been able to deal with the root causes of the drivers, of the kind of challenges that Africa is dealing with. I expect that a lot of the conversations that will happen around the report of the first 10 years in this summit should drive the agenda for, doubling the steps and trying to achieve a sense of wider reach of impact in the remaining years ahead when it comes to Agenda 2063.
So I want to go back to, when you're talking about the security situation and some of the things that happened for the continent in 2022. But according to a UNDP report, though, Sub-Saharan Africa has become a new global epicenter of violent extremism, with 48% of global terrorism deaths in 2021. So why the surge, despite a commitment to the African Union to silence the guns?
Two things. First is that the only way to achieve sustainable response to threats in Africa is not really at the continental level, it's at the state level. And the second is that which is a segue to the first point I made, is that governance is at the heart of all of these. And as the first, my other panelists indicated, Africa had huge challenges when it comes to managing governance issues in 2022. And so it's not surprising that a lot of the issues that are driving violent extremism, which has to do with issues of marginalization, issues of deeper governance questions, are not necessarily resolved. And so I feel that those issues and the rise in the number of violent extremism actually speaks to the kind of questions we need to be resolving as a continent when it comes to sustainable management of threats and dealing with violent extremism. I feel that going forward, unless the governance questions are dealt with, it will be very difficult for us to register significant improvements when it comes to the management of violent extremism. So I will blame it on the deeper governance questions, which are things that the continent will need to address strongly going forward.
Hannah, how much of that state of security will be affecting the continent in terms of trade issues? How will that complicate trade and investment for Africa?
Well, I think we do have a real challenge on the continent, because we are obviously we do take very seriously these challenges of peace and security, and of course it's very important to. At the same time, we have to remain focused on development. If we do not have development, if we do not have growth, we can't provide jobs. We cannot provide ways for people to find an income, and therefore they then move into terrorism and other violent extremism. So I kind of see it in a slightly different way, that what we must do is focus on trade. We must focus on development. Look, in 2023, 91% of African economies, despite how we constantly berate ourselves for being insecure and also for terrible governance and so on, 91% of our economies are projected by the World Bank to grow faster than the global forecast of 1.7%. So we have a real opportunity in 2023. And I think it's not by focusing directly on peace and security that we will achieve the right outcomes that we want. It is by, in a sense, focusing on development, focusing on our growth, making sure that we translate that growth into jobs and translate it into real shifts in standard of life for people. And that is how we will escape the peace and security challenges.
All right. Let's look at the African Union's track record here when it comes to peace and security. Dr. Asamoah, in which ways do you think the AU can do better when it comes to silencing the guns? Where are its efforts needed, especially now?
At the moment, the AU focuses quite much on responding to crises after they've emerged. What the AU can do better which will be much more cost effective, is to be engaged strongly on the prevention side. And that will mean paying attention to existing early warning mechanisms that the AU itself has, and then having the political will to go along with the recommendations of technical people who are working on these key issues. That is really where the change needs to be. And then extending that to mean that member states will have to be very critical in the way they manage their economies. As Hannah indicated, growth is important. Development is the key question. To the extent that countries are not able to meet the demands of their citizens, issues will continue to be very complicated, and those will end up on the continental table. And so doing what the AU needs to do within a multilateral framework, as well as going to the prevention side and engaging member states, will make a huge difference going forward.
Hannah, you did talk about Africa's growth in 2023 being higher than the global average, and the African Union has actually set, its agenda in growing the financial services, the services industry. How do you see the continent progressing, though, here?
Well, I think financing is going to be a significant area where I think that there's, in a sense, a little bit of a missing link here. And it's unfortunate that that has not also had a significant push on the continent this year, because there are, at the same time as growing, there are still, countries still are not yet getting enough revenues from their economies to be able to pay back debts and so on, which have obviously compounded since the COVID-19 crisis, and there were not enough international mechanisms to ensure that African countries could weather that crisis. So the financing issue is going to be a challenge. And yes, growing financial services is going to be a key means, and including through the AfCFTA. AfCFTA doesn't just cover goods trade, it also covers services trade and growing different sectors such as the tourism and financial sectors. But at the same time, we still need to deal with some of these fundamental questions around how do we get the finance that we need as a continent in order to ensure that we have enough infrastructure, for example, for trade. And I think this is an area that seems to be missing. I'm hoping, Beatrice, that with the African Union, there's a big push at the moment for the African Union to be permanently represented at the G20, a big push which Senegal, the previous head of the AU, will now be handing over to Comoros. And this should be a key agenda item for Comoros to take forward. I'm hoping that that will be a means for the continent to really advocate for itself. But definitely there's going to be a need for a coordination mechanism on the continent to really think about what is going to be our position when we go to international forums on financing and making sure that we have enough support from the international community to get out of these debt challenges.
Indeed, and thank you both so much for being a part of this conversation. Well, that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, African Union Commission Deputy Chairperson, Dr. Monique Nsanzabaganwa, Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, and Andrews Atta Asamoah, Head of the African Peace and Security Governance Program at ISS Africa. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter, and you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's bye-bye.